What's up YouTube? My name is John, Jags, and I have a story to tell. When I bought my first couple of lenses, I was super excited because I was able to do all different types of photography. Portraits, landscape, product, food. But there was one thing I learned about those last two. For product and food, sometimes you gotta get really close to that subject. If you don't have a lens that can perform for those tasks, you're gonna be very disappointed. So today we're gonna be talking about my current favorite lens, the 90mm macro, and why I think you should consider having a macro lens in your photography, videography arsenal. So obviously we're talking about macro photography, and what does that mean? Well, according to the Google machine, if we unlock the phone, macro photography is extreme close-up photography, usually of very small subjects and living organisms like insects or food or something like that, in which the size of the subject in the photograph is greater than life size. Basically, your subject fills up the frame and takes up the entire composition. So why would you ever need something like this? Well, it's great for products like toys, and it's great for food or fun stuff like that. So, what is a macro lens? A macro lens is basically a lens that allows you to get super duper close to your subject so you can get those awesome close-up shots. Now, what makes a macro lens different from, say, a regular lens like a 55mm or an 85? It is the minimum focus distance. What is that? So what makes macro photography different is that macro lenses are specifically designed to get really close to their subject. So different lenses will have a different minimum focus distance, basically how close you can get to your subject. I own 4 lenses, and each one I use for different purposes when it comes to, say, product photography or food photography, and really it comes down to the minimum focus distance, how close I can get to my subject before the subject gets blurry. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take some photos of Mr. Tony Stark right here and show you the different looks that you can get with these lenses at the shortest distance away from the subject. The 16 to 35mm lens I own has a 28cm minimum focus distance, about a foot, so I can get pretty close to my subject and basically be in focus. My next lens up is my 55mm lens, and I can get 1.64 feet away from my subject before it gets blurry. That is 50 centimeters. And then the 85mm lens that I own has a whopping 2.64 feet minimum focus distance. That is really, really far. That is, in centimeters, 80 centimeters. Now, the kicker here is that my telephoto macro lens, my 90mm macro lens, has a minimum focus distance of 28 centimeters, or about a foot. So, the benefit of a macro lens is I can get really close to my subject and you can get a really cool look with this. So with those 4 lenses, each one has a minimum focus distance that's gonna have different benefits for different types of photography. I use my 90mm macro lens most of the time when I need to get those close-up detail shots. When a lot of photographers buy their first camera and their first lens, they'll try and take some super close-up photos of food or grass or something like that and then be really confused. Why is my photo blurry? It's because of that minimum focus distance. So there are some benefits outside of just being super close to that subject with a macro lens, and that is basically isolating your subject. What I mean by that is when you get as close to your subject as possible, or when you bring your subject super close to that lens, that depth of field is going to shrink and shrink and shrink, and you can get some really cool isolating photos. Let's go through some of those. So as we saw with this next batch of photos, is that you can really isolate your subject and get your subject to be the main focus point, so to speak. Now, there is a couple things to be conscious of when you do this. One, as you get closer to your subject, like I said, your depth of field is going to get smaller and smaller to the point where you're so close, that depth of field is going to be paper thin. To compensate for that, you're going to have to bring up your f-stop number. So all the photos that I've been showing you so far, I'm shooting at like f5.6 or higher, so then I can get my subject in focus. If I brought it down to say 2.8, which is the minimum f-stop for this lens, then my depth of field would be so thin I would basically be getting just like the eye in focus. So when you do that, you also have to be conscious of your light and how much light you have. So when you bring up your f-stop number, you're letting less light into that lens, and because of that, you're going to either need more light or increase your ISO on your photos. So when you isolate your subjects, make sure you're conscious of where your depth of field is and how wide it is, so that if you're shooting something super close, you have a depth of field that is big enough to get your entire subject in focus. So be conscious of your f-stop number and how much light you have. The next thing we want to talk about is filling the frame. What does that mean? So when you fill the frame, it's basically taking your subject and having it fill up the entire composition of the photo. And what's interesting about this concept is that we as human beings only see the perspective through our eyes. So I don't know what the focal length of our eyes are, but it's definitely a wide angle lens, so to speak. So what's really cool about the macro photography look is that you get to see the world from a perspective that we would never ever see through our own eyes, because we're able to get so close to that subject and see that compression of the photo with a telephoto macro lens. We can get those really cool details of, say, like a bowl of nuts or a Lego piece or even a toy. Like even the toy photography that I've been showing you so far, those figures are like yay big. In fact, they are yay big, and basically we get to see, like, I'm as close as I can to this cactus cat, and it's blurry now. Like if I look straight at it, it's blurry, I can't see it. But with a macro lens, what you can do is you can get that perspective that you would never see with your own eyes. So what do you need to be conscious of when it comes to using a macro lens? My general tips for macro photography are these. 1, make sure you're conscious of your light and how much light you're letting into that lens. So where's your depth of field at? Where is your f-stop at to compensate? And after that, where's your ISO at to compensate for the lack of light that you're letting into the lens? Typically speaking, for the macro photography that I do, I'll either shoot outdoors where it's like super duper bright out, or I'll have a big light source, or I will just have to increase the ISO. That's just a non-negotiable thing. If you have a too dark image, you can't see it. So be conscious of your light with macro photography. Next, another big thing to be conscious of is your shutter speed when you're shooting. So I'm using a 90mm macro lens, and a general rule of thumb is to shoot at a shutter speed that is equivalent to your focal length. So the closest shutter speed for my 90mm macro is 1/100, 1/100th of a second. So I need to make sure my shutter speed is that, or use a tripod. You can have a longer shutter speed if you have a tripod, and you can set your camera on the timer release. So after 2 seconds, it'll take the shutter and you don't get those micro jitters, because the outside of a too dark image, the worst thing that you can have is a blurry image. So make sure that your shutter speed is appropriate for whatever setting you're using. If you're doing handheld, 1/100, unless you have very steady hands, or use a tripod with a timer release or a remote. Last thing I want to show you when it comes to using and owning a macro lens is basically what the difference in f-stop will be if you shoot at different f-stops. So here is one at f2.8. That depth of field is so shallow, we're getting a very, very thin plane of focus, so a lot of the figure is actually out of focus. Generally speaking, I wouldn't shoot at this f-stop unless I'm going for a very stylized look. Otherwise, I would shoot at something definitely higher. So here's one at f5.6. And we can see now that more things are generally in focus, but there's still some aspects of the figure that are just not in focus. But as a result of bringing up that aperture number, what I had to do is increase my light source in some capacity or increase my ISO. Now, here's one at f11. And we can see here that my figure is now getting more and more in focus, but the light is changing, the grain is changing, the noise is changing because I either have to add more light from my light sources or I have to add some ISO to basically compensate for the lack of light that I'm letting into the lens with my f-stop. And here's one more at f22. This is as closed down as my lens can go, and we can see that more things are pretty much in focus now. But the downside is I had to use my ISO a lot more to get my exposure correctly. But yeah, that's basically it. I want to share with you why I love this macro lens, and I really do think it is one of those lenses that should belong in most people's arsenal. In fact, I probably use this lens second most to my 16-35 because the 16-35 is my general all-around using lens, but when it comes to getting those detail shots, the 90mm macro is the thing to buy. Now, the last thing I want you to remember is that when you are buying a lens, look at the minimum focus distance, especially if you're doing product photography or if you're doing food photography, because if you have a lens that is, you can't get super close to your subject and you need those shots, you'll be very much disappointed like I was when I purchased my first couple of lenses. So that's it. I hope you learned something. Guess what? We're up to 245 subscribers now on YouTube, so thank you very much, my friends, for joining this party, whatever this party is all about. I appreciate you. If you enjoyed this video and you did learn something, leaving a comment in the comment section down below or punching the crap out of that like button, it would be very much appreciated. Lets me know that I'm creating content that is of value to you. So thank you. I will talk to you, beautiful people, in that next one. Eat your protein. In fact, 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. So that's it. Goodbye, my friends. Have a wonderful day. Lens cap.
Put the place up.